I was given the talk coal seam gas in New South Wales, but actually it's a lot more than that. I think we're just looking at the tip of what we're starting to refer to as a gas bomb, which is the massive development of unconventional gas of all types in Australia at the current time. Okay, so the two main messages from this talk that I want you to take away, and one is that we really don't need and don't want any more gas of any description. DA holds that there should be no further development of any sort of onshore natural gas in Australia. And the two reasons are because of global heating and also due to local health impacts from the processes that are required to extract that gas. And we're not alone in our concerns which we've been voicing since 2011, have also been voiced very adequately and succinctly by the AMA actually, saying if in doubt turn CSG off, referring to the precautionary principle which should be applied with a relatively new industry such as unconventional gas drilling. But also the Public Health Association of Australia and those other organisations that you say there have been very active in their advocacy over many years, trying to bring the concerns, the health concerns of CSG, shale and so on to the attention of our politicians and our policymakers. So what is this thing? There's a picture there on the left of an export terminal being built, I think it might be Gladstone, for liquefied natural gas. On the right's a picture of a gas field in southern Queensland, the Tara gas field. And you're high up in the air there, and what you see is a network of roads and then these little well pads. Because unconventional gas is difficult to extract. It holds tightly to its rock formation, whether it be a coal seam, shale or tight sands limestone. So what you need to do is pockmark the area with multiple wells, connect those wells, drill down, drill horizontally, use hydraulic fracturing, which basically breaks up the rock formation and makes it more easy for the gas to be released. A lot of water is released in the process. That water is salty, it's full of coal seam, contaminants such as heavy metals, radioactive isotopes, and a lot of salt. So it's a very industrial process. It crisscrosses the land, it disturbs land use patterns, and it has many potential local sources of air and water pollution, soil contamination, not to mention the land clearing as well that goes on for the infrastructure. In New South Wales, we have one coal seam gas field in southwest Sydney run by AGL, which is due to be decommissioned over the next few years. DEA fought very hard to have an expansion. The northern expansion stopped back in 2013, and indeed it was stopped, and many good protections were put in place by the incoming coalition government that year, setbacks and protections for residential areas, which made that project and many others that were still in the process of development and approval basically took them off the table. And in fact, the New South Wales government, coalition government, to give them credit, bought back a whole lot of licences. There were coal seam gas licences all over the metropolitan Sydney basin, everywhere. In fact, they were going to drill in St Peters. And that was part of the very first talk that I gave in 2011. So what have we got left? Gloucester, we stopped. The amazing people of the Northern Rivers part of New South Wales stopped coal seam gas drilling up there in the what's now famous Bentley blockade, where the community just rose up and said no, and really the government had no choice. What we have left is an exploratory project in the Pilliga, near the Pilliga State Forest, and that's that little splodge of green that you can see well away from the coast, more or less the centre of that picture. The Narrabri Gas Project is run by Santos. It bought it from Eastern Star. There was about 56 exploratory wells. Santos had to shut down most of them because they were basically didn't meet industry standards. And I'll tell you a little bit about this project through the talk, just to give you some examples of the way things turn out with unconventional gas. So basically, we want very much to stop this one going ahead because it could be the thin end of the wedge in New South Wales, and it still hasn't had its final approvals. I think there's a Planning Assessment Commission coming up. I'm looking at Kate, she might know. I don't think a date has even been announced for that. So our concerns and our advocacy over this, joining together with many other green groups, has worked so far to delay it, you'll be pleased to know. But that is going to be 850 coal seam gas wells through the Pilliga State Forest, through surrounding farmland, and there's a lot of opposition to it locally, as you can imagine. It's right over the southern recharge of the Great Artesian Basin, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you how important that is for agriculture in Australia. So, how does unconventional natural gas development erode health? Well, it does it through the environmental determinants of health, which are the biggest things that hold our health. If you think of the centre of that diagram being our own genetics, our own lifestyle, where we live, our socio-economic factors, moving out of the centre of that circle, you come to environmental factors, and the biggies are clean air, clean water, a stable climate, nature obviously, and safe food. So I'm just going to go through the climate impacts first, because I think these are the things that keep me awake at night. All right, the local health impacts are horrible, but this is the one that is most concerning. There's a lot said about how gas is so great and it's so clean and it's so cheap. You've all heard this, right? And really our state and national governments do believe that it's an important transitional fuel as we move to a low emissions economy. And they think that it can be made safe for the local communities, and that it's overall a force for good in our current situation. And it was named a transition fuel because when you burn it, it produces only half the CO2 emissions that coal does at the point of combustion. But you have to take into consideration all the emissions that go into actually producing it, drilling it, exploring it, producing it, mopping up the waste, and so on. And if you're going to export it, you have to liquefy it, which is an energy-intense operation, and then you have to regas it at the other end. So when you take the whole life cycle, there's only a very marginal benefit in terms of lower CO2 emissions when you burn it. So it's also a costly fuel. We're actually paying in the eastern half of Australia twice what they pay in WA for their gas. We're also paying more than what the international price is for gas these days. And it's actually not a very profitable industry. When you look at the industry in the United States and Canada, and also here, there have been very large write-downs. There's a whole coal seam gas field in Queensland that didn't end up being built because it just wasn't profitable. So it's actually expensive to extract coal seam and unconventional gas. Natural gas, of course, is methane. It's just that little molecule there, very innocuous looking thing, but it's actually one of the climate forces. So over a 20-year time span, it's 86 times more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2. So it's often accounted for in terms of its 100-year time span, where it's 20 times, but actually it's the next 20 years that are going to make or break our efforts to stabilise our climate. And when you look at the whole lifestyle and you look at it burnt for power, you only need to lose a tiny fraction of that gas as what they call fugitive emissions. That's methane just venting straight into the atmosphere to completely wipe out any benefit that it has over coal. Far from being a transition fuel, it's probably just a massive distraction. In fact, these are very conservative figures because in the US, estimates are that between 2 and 17% sometimes of the gas escapes as fugitive emissions. So this is why we're now referring it to it as the gas bomb. atmospheric methane has had taken a sharp uptick since about 2006, and it accounts for up to 25% of our heat trapping at the moment. Oil and gas production is responsible for up to 3/4 of the methane that humans produce, so it's really very significant. And Australia is on the cusp of a massive expansion in conventional and unconventional gas extraction, with large developments in the Northern Territory, WA, Queensland, and potentially here, if the New South Wales government goes in that direction. We're also on track, if not already, the world's #1 LNG exporter, producing about 1/5 of the supply internationally. So Australia's emissions currently are 5% of global emissions if you include our fossil fuel exports. So that's 1 in 20. It's 1/20th of the whole entire problem of climate change is just from Australia. It's just mind-blowing, considering we're a small country with a low population. So, but current developments on the table here in Australia could increase that to a proportion of up to 17% of global emissions by 2030. And a fair bit of that is gas. So there's abundant LNG flooding an international market and actually displacing renewables. This is why this is not a transitional fuel, it's not a bridge, it's a distraction, it's actually delaying the transition that we need. In fact, total fossil fuel use in the USA that has done the most unconventional gas drilling hasn't changed. They've just shifted it from coal to gas. Fugitive emissions are routinely underestimated, or they're not measured at all, and they're not regulated. And this is just outstanding. I mean, unbelievable. I can't believe that. Anyway, in Australia, there, according to a review by some academics at, I think it's University of Melbourne, there's been no comprehensive, rigorous, and independently verifiable audit of gas emissions in Australia either, and yet we're forging right on out there. So the spin that the fossil fuel companies have given us that gas is green and clean has totally convinced our political system, and we have to work very hard against that myth. Delays action on greenhouse gas reduction, and it's going to make it impossible for us in Australia to meet our climate target of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And yeah, it does keep me awake at night, I have to say. It should keep us all awake at night. So in terms of the local health impacts, they're mediated through water and air, largely. I'm going to zip through a few slides here. These are all the concerns that DEA has been voicing for the last 8 years that are in countless submissions. And we've recently published a position statement. It's an oil and gas paper that really summarises the current literature beautifully. And I think John's got a few copies of an executive summary that are on the front desk. Have a look. It's an incredible amount of work. And it really goes through these highly complex concerns in great detail and represents the current state of evidence. So we have a national chemical regulator. A lot of chemicals are involved in this process. You use them for fracking fluids, you use them for drilling, you release them from the coal seam. The ones that have been voluntarily surrendered for assessment by the companies, because they say it's commercial in confidence, have been assessed by this government body, and there are plenty that are harmful, and there's plenty that they don't know. And who knows how many other chemicals have been used since 2012. There's no routine disclosure, it's not mandatory, and there's no routine assessment. So these are some that are in the Santos EIS. They're irritants, they're toxic, they're not what you'd want, in your backyard. Wastewater has got a lot of stuff in it, and there's a lot of it. You have to take the water out before the gas flows, and then you've got this plenty of this very salty fluid that you have to work out what you do with it, and you put it in a holding pond that's lined with builder's plastic, and you hope that the plastic doesn't tear. And you hope that it's not spilled, or you spray it on roads to control the dust, or you put it through a reverse osmosis plant if you've got some money, which removes 90% of the water, which can be then used for beneficial use, but then you've got this salty sludge that has to be heated, dried into a salt that is not the salt that you can use on the table because it's full of heavy metals, BTEX and whatnot, and then you have to find somewhere to put the salt. In fact, the Narrabri Gas Project in full operation will produce 2.5 B double trucks per day of that salt. Where do you put it? They haven't actually explained where they're going to put it. Queensland CSG is going to produce 31 million tonnes of salt over 30 years, and that's enough to fill the MCG 15 times to the brim with salt. In a dry land that struggles with salination, that's a real concern. You can see why farmers hate this shit stuff. Sorry. And we also spill stuff around when we're doing the industry. So US spill rates based on tens of thousands of wells that they have going there mean that between 15 to 130 spills of wastewater can be expected in the Narrabri Gas Project. However, even in the development exploration phase of 50 wells, there have been multiple spills, and some of them quite significant. Some have killed vegetation, and they've been fined multiple times by the New South Wales government. An aquifer became contaminated because wastewater leaking out of a holding pond got into the soil, and that mobilised some of the natural soil components into an aquifer, and they found uranium, many times the Safe Drinking Water Guideline, in that aquifer in the Pilliga State Forest. And that's a mechanism that nobody had even thought of. So it was the salt in the wastewater that mobilised these components out of the soil and into the aquifer. So strange things happen with this industry. Probably about half the health impacts are going to happen through air pollution, volatile organic compounds. We've just heard all about these sorts of elements from Ben, and they come off with the fugitive emissions from the drilling fluids, the fracking fluids, the flowback, the wastewater, and so on. Then you've got multiple truck movements. You've got diesel machinery with the drilling. You get a lot of ground level ozone. You've got gas fields in rural parts of Utah and Wyoming that have got worse air quality and more ozone than LA. That's from 12 months from the current Narrabri gas facility. That's from our National Pollution Inventory. So in terms of actual what we've studied of people's health, back into even 2014, there were no comprehensive population-based studies of public health effects from this industry. We've had some, exploratory articles in the MJA, really urging the precautionary principle, talking about the overseas experience and urging caution. But in the last 5-6 years, and exponentially, there's been a growing body of literature actually studying health of people who've had to live in these gas fields, mostly from overseas, mostly from the United States. And the evidence is incomplete, but what is there is extremely concerning. There's a few papers there. I'm not going to go into those, but they're all available, and they're all in this amazing document that my colleagues put together. So silica exposure is a major problem for fracking. They use a lot of sand. It gets into the air, gets into the workers' lungs. There's chemicals in use for fracking and drilling that have got carcinogenic potential, that are endocrine disruptors, which means if they get into the environment and if exposure is even very, very low, they can affect fertility, they can affect the growth of an unborn child, and so on. Air pollution from these developments can increase asthma, respiratory disease, cancer risk. You can get skin and respiratory conditions, and this has been documented to occur with greater frequency the closer you are to an active well. And then there's the low birth weight, small for gestational age, higher frequency of preterm birth defects as well that are increasingly and very concerningly being documented. And there's also social and mental health consequences that can begin even when the development is first proposed for a community. You can get community division, you can get people who oppose versus people who support, you can get people starting to worry about their livelihood. It can be one of the major factors determining a farmer's health, and that's been studied in Australia and Queensland. And if you're from an Indigenous community and you live so close to the land, you're at even greater risk of mental and spiritual suffering due to the proposed development and to the development itself. And when I was up in Narrabri this time last year with John, we spoke as part of a forum, and there were some local Indigenous people who came in to the end of the forum, and they spoke very eloquently of the impacts that they've already experienced in their local area because of Santos's exploratory project. So just to conclude, we understand the harms well enough to know that further expansion of gas development will severely harm human health and well-being into the future through exacerbating global heating and through local health impacts. And it's time to defuse the gas bomb. We neither need nor have time for this transition fuel.